can be arrested for any offense, any Class C misdemeanor other than speeding or open containment. And in fact, if you're speeding over a certain amount, like I don't know if it's 90 or 100 miles an hour, I think it's 100, you can be arrested. And maybe that's justified if you're creating a huge danger. But I think for most of these Class Cs, the idea that you're going to be arresting this mother for not wearing her seatbelt is a bit ridiculous, and obviously we're all going to be paying for the jail. So that actually is an interesting issue for us to talk about too, because there have been a lot of issues relating to the Harris County Jail recently, and one of the other areas we're working on is pretrial justice reform. You have a number of people who may have been arrested for a small amount of marijuana and they just don't have the money to post bail, so they're sitting in jail at a cost of $75 a day to taxpayers. So there are people obviously who, if you're arrested for suspected of murder or rape or something like that, you probably do need to stay in jail all the way up until your trial. But for people that don't pose a danger, and there's actually some really good actuarial assessment instruments to figure out what somebody's past record is, what their risk level is, to determine whether they're safe to be released. But for most people, if you haven't been found guilty of a crime yet and you're there pre-trial, there's a real danger you may lose your job while you're in jail and may become a higher risk by staying there for a period of time before your trial. So I'm really excited that I think there's an opportunity to make some major changes with this pretrial justice area. So one of the other things, of course, is we're looking at the issues involving the state prison system and sentencing. Texas, back in 2007, we really hit a critical point where there was a projection by the Legislative Budget Board back in January 2007. We would need to build 17,000 prison beds by 2012. And so what we did, of course, was work with legislators back in 2007 to come up with some alternatives like expanding drug courts. And we actually, not only did we not end up building those beds, which would have cost billions of dollars to build and operate, we actually have now closed 4 prisons. We've closed even more juvenile facilities. And crime is at its lowest point in Texas since 1967. So we're pretty pleased with that. We still have one of the top 6 incarceration rates in the United States. Obviously, there's people who need to be in prison, and we want to be very clear about that, but we also have about 17,000 people in prison in Texas for drug possession. And I think that number is quite a bit too high, particularly when you look at those people. There's about 40% of them who don't have any prior substantial felonies. So that's a group that, again, could be going into things like drug court, probation, requiring them to hold a job, get treatment, instead of, as we call it, 3 hops on a cob in prison, where you're basically, back a number of years ago, Phil Gramm was talking about welfare reform and said we need more people pulling the wagon and fewer people riding in it. Well, being in prison is, in fact, riding in the wagon. What we have some legislation coming up this session that deals with less than a gram of drugs, which of course a gram is like a sweet low packet, so it's a very small amount. But basically it would take that down from a state jail felony to a Class A misdemeanor, punishable by up to a year in the county jail. And we estimate it would save the state about $63 million. So obviously we're dealing with a difficult budget situation, and we think it's a sensible approach to take. And certainly when you give someone a felony, you're also making it very difficult for them to get a job, get a place to live for, frankly, the rest of their life. So that's also an important consideration. So I'm very excited about kind of the whole trend nationally in this area. I think really where Right on Crime has come in, and we started Right on Crime in 2010, kind of building on the success in Texas. For many years, the whole area of criminal justice reform was dominated by folks on the left. And you'll find people on the left who, they don't think anyone should be in prison, or they tend to say crime is society's fault and kind of overlook the idea of personal responsibility, restitution for victims, some really important concepts. So I think we take kind of a balance. You have to balance mercy and justice. And that's kind of where we come in. And I think if you actually look, more than 30 states have adopted these type of reforms, typically, which say we're going to send fewer nonviolent offenders to prison, but we're also going to do things like drug courts and mental health treatment and better probation with smaller caseloads, swift and certain sanctions. One of the big issues we have in Texas also is people being revoked from probation back to prison. And if you miss a meeting with your probation officer, you could be revoked. Now, you probably shouldn't be, especially if it's your first meeting, and the thing is you don't want to ignore it, and that's where kind of these swift and certain sanctions come in. So if you have what are called the technical violation of probation, you don't wait for a bunch of them to pile up. It's kind of like a kid touching a stove, and then months later say, okay, well now you've had 10 missed meetings, so we're going to send you to prison for 10 years. No, you say, okay, you're going to have a curfew. You're going to go to jail for the weekend. It's actually the swiftness and the shortness of the sanction that changes behavior more than the duration. So that's the whole thing about changing. Half the people coming into prison, both in Texas and nationally, are people that are revoked from parole or probation, and then half of those are for these technical violations, not a new offense. So we're going to have some legislation to deal with that. But again, it's kind of the tough love approach, the swift and certain sanctions, not saying we're just going to ignore something, but on the other hand, not coming down like a ton of bricks if the person isn't a danger to the public. So at the end of the day, I think these issues dovetail very well with the principles of limited government, personal responsibility, obviously saving tax dollars, and frankly, ultimately liberty. And that's really where the forfeiture and the issue of the number of crimes and the lack of intent requirement really is so important. So I'd love to take any questions you have, and I would really invite all of you, to the extent you're in communication with your legislators, you're up in Austin testifying next session, look for these bills that we're working on, and it'd be super helpful to have your support, because I'll tell you, unlike some of the other issues we work on at TDPF in terms of cutting the budget, cutting taxes, school vouchers, and so forth, we actually have, to be honest, more of a challenge with Republicans on some of these issues than we do with Democrats. So there are members who are very worried about obviously being seen as soft on crime and so forth, and that's an understandable concern. But we would basically say you need to be both tough and smart. So I'd love to have your help on this, and be glad to take any questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I think one point on civil asset forfeiture that I don't think maybe I missed it, but you didn't touch on, was that even if you address it as a state issue, there's still a federal issue with equitable sharing. So I've talked to Senator Burton's staff, and we're waiting for the bill to come out. So I'm kind of concerned that, as like many good bills are, that something might get watered down before it gets out. So I hope everyone's aware that, like, even if you outlaw it at the state level, the feds still give them a kickback, and they just say, well, it's a federal thing, we're going to kick it up to the feds, and then they give them a kickback. So you got the same problem even if we outlaw it at state level. So there has to be something that says that they can't benefit from the federal equitable sharing too. Yeah,
no, you're absolutely right. So basically what they do is, if it's done through one of these drug task forces, or there's some nexus with another state, or any excuse they can to go in jointly on this with the federal government, federal law enforcement, then it enables them to bypass even the due process protections and various state laws around asset forfeiture. So it is a huge loophole, and it'll be interesting to see how, obviously we're going to have a new Attorney General, how that gets handled. But I think the federal asset forfeiture really should focus on international drug kingpins, cartels, and so forth. We've seen cases. There was a guy in the Cincinnati airport or whatever who had some bunch of cash. He was going to make a movie in Hollywood or something, and he ends up, and there's like 10 law enforcement agencies, federal and state, that were splitting this. Then there was another case, now this wasn't federal, but this Burmese guy who was raising money, it was a Christian rock, he was raising money for like victims of some catastrophe in Burma, but he had tens of thousands of dollars driving from Oklahoma, and they just took all his money. I mean, he hadn't done anything wrong, and it took him many, many months to get it back. So these are the kind of, innocent until proven guilty cases that, guilty until proven innocent that we're seeing.
And another tool that we have is this issue is addressed in our Republican platform, our state party platform, that you can use when you talk to your legislators.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for your work on this too. Oh yeah, Don.
So, with the new district attorney here in Harris County, how does Dallas County handle it? Do they do all the asset forfeiture cases because Harris County does thousands of them on a yearly basis with all 38 law enforcement agencies. Does Dallas do it the same way? And now that we have a new DA or law enforcement agency is going to go after somebody else to prosecute, and they farm this work out, or how's that going to work?
No, I'm not really sure about that, but I'm so glad you spoke up, because we were just talking before we started about grand jury reform, which I totally forgot to discuss. But is a big part of our agenda, and Rick Perry feels passionate about this after what he's been through, $3 million. But we met with Tom DeLay actually about a month ago, and he feels equally passionately. I mean, they took the same exact case against Tom DeLay to 3 different grand juries until they get indictment on midnight or whatever the deadline was. But so part of the reform package for this session is going to be, you can't keep taking the same case without any substantial new evidence to just shop to as many grand juries as you want until they indict. And then also requiring this bill is going to say the defense is entitled to its transcript of the grand jury proceedings. I know Governor Perry, because I've talked to him about it, is very concerned about whatever they told the grand jury. I mean, clearly it was a frivolous case, but who knows what they told in the back room, what the prosecutors told them. And one of the other aspects of the legislation is going to require that any exculpatory evidence be shared with the grand jury by the prosecutor. So it really goes to the whole purpose is to the system ought to be to promote justice. It's not a game where you're just trying to get the conviction at any cost or an indictment at any cost. So Arizona is actually implementing most of these grand jury reforms, and they've had no difficulty. I've spoken with the Attorney General and conservative prosecutors there who are conservative, and they say it's working just fine. But we certainly expect, some scare tactics from prosecutors saying this is too much transparency and so forth. But the whole grand jury system came about as a protection of individual liberty, because as soon as you're indicted, by the way, your reputation is sullied, and not even for individuals also, but even companies like Arthur Anderson, as you may remember, was indicted, ultimately not convicted of anything, but the whole company went bankrupt. If you have any contracts, once you're indicted that involve the government, you're debarred. So, for example, if you're in the healthcare business and you take Medicaid payments or whatever, you're done with, or construction contracts with a government entity and all that. So there's just enormous consequences to being indicted. And unfortunately, currently, we just don't have protection, so prosecutors can come in and tell the grand jury anything, have many, many grand juries until they get what they want.
One of the problems I don't completely understand, I hate to reveal my ignorance, but there seems to be a lot of cash involved in just putting people in prison or in your county jail. You seem to make a lot of money doing that. And as evidence, I know several individual cases, but the big one, they arrested 175 or 177 bikers up in Waco, put them all in jail, gave them all $1 million bonds, even though the average bond for a murderer in Texas is less than $50,000. And all of a sudden the jail that was virtually bankrupt is flush with cash, and so there have been no convictions.
Yep.
But asset forfeiture, these guys lost their lives, their businesses, their families, their motor vehicles, and once again, no actual convictions so far.
Yeah, no, the first, I did just read the first trial is supposed to be set for January, but it's like, I don't know, it's one or a few people, and there's like 175, and they charged them all with the same thing. I mean, there's some video, but for most of them, there's really very little
The video that
evidence.
they released was dramatically edited.
Yeah.
They've never released the entire unedited video.
That's not true. They've released that information to the press.
Okay, I've never been able to find the actual unedited video. Everything I've seen had edits in it.
So for y'all, we have to find, this was the Cossacks versus the Banditos, and I mean, they're both bad, but I think one of them is quite a bit worse and more violent than the other. But I mean, it's very complicated to unwind. I mean, I do have some sympathy for prosecutors to unwind who did what, but I think you have an obligation to try to attempt to do that. I mean, I think there probably were some people there who, certainly we don't have kind of guilt by association in this country, so I think it was reprehensible what occurred, right? But you have to kind of, if you don't have possible cause to believe somebody committed a crime, you shouldn't arrest them, and you need even a higher standard theoretically to indict. So, I mean, to just charge everybody with the same thing, there's a real question about whether there's adequate evidence there. So. But one of the points is that this DA, Abel Reyna, he doesn't bear the cost of the jail or any of the consequences that come from this. So I mean, there's a temptation if you're the prosecutor, just throw everything out there and see what sticks, charge everybody, and ask questions later.
Right.
Thank you very much. That was great. Thank you. I have to apologize. I'm going to be leaving in a few minutes. We're having our Christmas party this afternoon. Thank you very much.
All right.
I wasn't planning on. I didn't think about filming when I moved back there.
We have Charles Blain here with us. He's with Empower Texans, which is a group that Mark mentioned here a second ago. They do some really great work as far as watchdogging the Texas legislature. They have a contract index, a conservative rating index. So they let us know how wise they're spending our money up in Austin. They are working on an initiative around civil asset forfeiture. If I'm not mistaken, he's going to talk on that a little bit. And just because they're so closely monitoring the situation in Austin with the upcoming legislative session, he's going to talk a little bit about what to expect, what kind of bills have been already filed, and how this legislative session is starting to shape up. So, Charles Blain with Empower Texans.
You guys are going to have to excuse me. I'm going to look at my phone a little bit because we just came out with our legislative priorities and I want to make sure I hit a decent amount of it. So as you mentioned, yeah, we work for Empower Texans. We do a lot of watchdog stuff. We focus on, fiscal accountability, transparency, all that good stuff in government, and we make a lot of enemies doing so. It's always fun. As well as our criminal justice reform project that we kicked off about a year ago called Restore Justice USA. And I'm heading that up, and we're focusing on a lot of things that Mark mentioned, so I'm not going to go too deep into that. But as far as our legislative priorities for Empower Texans, something that's leading the list that we're focusing on under our kind of budget and taxation reform area is a switch to zero-based budgeting. So right now, just kind of a brief primer, they do the incremental budgeting where a department head will come in and say they were getting, there's an extremely low amount, about 100,000 last year, now we need 10,000 more. And they don't have to justify, why or say how efficient it is or anything like that. So we want to kind of start from zero and make them justify every dollar that they need. It's an uphill battle, but we think it's worth it, and we're hoping to see some change there. Another issue we're going to be focusing on is election integrity. There have been numerous issues from Hill County to Tarrant County to even out in the valley with this last election. So a couple of things underneath that kind of umbrella that we want to look at is the rolling polling issue of them kind of moving these polling locations around and picking them where they think that they're going to have the best turnout of voters that are going to support their issue. Another issue that we've kind of dabbled in and we're kind of starting to push a little more is the idea of closed primaries. And I'm originally from New Jersey, so I'm a big proponent of closed primaries. We have them there. So that's something that kind of falls under that guise that we want to do too. And ballot transparency. The bonds have been a huge issue that our guy up in Dallas has been writing about. Ross Kessler does amazing work when it comes to kind of ballot reform and bond transparency. And what we want to see is when we put a bond on the ballot, just simply we would like to either get bond out and voted, or we'd like to see what kind of debt that the local entity already has before we vote on it. Just more transparency when it comes to voting on bonds, because right now there is none. Under the educational reform umbrella, school choice is a big one that we obviously support, but there are other issues under education reform that we do support. So one of them is these kind of overlapping issues, which primarily in Harris County and Dallas Department of Education and Harris County Department of Education. So we would like to see those go away. We're kind of starting to do some more work on this, and I think it was Bob Hall recently sent us some information that said Dallas County Department of Education has $75 million of debt that they've never had to hold an election on because they're not really. Apparently, when they created these districts, they didn't give them the authority to hold elections, so they create these kind of offset corporations that take on this debt. So there's a lot of debt being racked up in these two departments that nobody really knows what they do. And Eric Dick was recently elected to the Harris County Department of Education, and his main goal on this area is to destroy it. So I don't know if you see that happen. And also in election integrity, ballot transparency. So yeah, I think those are pretty much the issues there that we want to focus on. And then also in school reform, we'd like to see an abolition of prophethood, which would be fantastic. I think that's going to also be a very uphill battle, but we would like to see that happen. We would also like to see more transparency when it comes to elections for school districts and county elections, city elections. Up in Dallas, they kind of have them in May. Here we have them in November. Ross has found a lot of issues up in Dallas when it comes to that, how the lack of promotion when it comes to these things, and obviously that all goes back to ballot transparency. So we want to see some reform there too. Two issues that I'm focusing on heavily are the union dues issue and the pension reform issue. Union dues, currently, local and state entities are allowed to withdraw union dues for public sector union dues. transfer them over to the unions. There's a case that we've been following very closely here in Harris County, Houston, where SEIU waged this long fought war against a local company called PJS, Professional Janitorial Service, and it was called the Justice for Janitors campaign. And they used every deceptive tactic in the book to attack them, from lying to their clients about them not paying their janitors fair wages. They were filing unfair labor practice lawsuits, all of these things. After a 10-year fight, they recently lost the lawsuit and got, I think it was a $7.1 billion judgment against them. The reason I mention this is because a lot of these unions that were, the public sector unions that we're collecting this money for, we're giving it to them so that they can do activities like this to our private business. They're prohibited from using this money for political purposes, but once it gets into their coffers, I mean, there's very little transparency there for how they use it. Even charities are heavily governed and monitored more so than public sector unions. So we'd like to see a lot of change when it comes to that, because there's no reason to be fully private sector industry. And pension reform is another major issue. In Houston, you guys all know about it. There's no need to kind of dive deep into it, but it's absolutely horrible what's going on. And we'd like to see a change from defined benefit to defined contribution. Unfortunately, the bill that Dan Flynn is carrying for Sylvester Turner does not have that provision in it. But we do hope that Bencourt's going to put up a good fight against that, and we're going to see some change. A bill that Bencourt did file was a bill to prohibit local entities from issuing public obligation bonds, pension obligation bonds. So back in, I want to say maybe it was the 90s, or SB 1696 was passed. And what that did was that allowed local entities to pass pension obligation bonds just there in council to cover their pension. So Houston and Sylvester Turner's plan is to pass $1 billion of pension obligation bonds. So the bill that was filed by Bencourt is an emergency bill that would prohibit local entities from being able to do that with that voter. So we're hoping to see some movement on that, and that would allow, obviously, voters to be involved in the process, because right now they don't have a seat at the table when it comes to pensions, or when it comes to passing pension obligation bonds or anything like that. So hopefully we're keeping our fingers crossed about moving on that. Dan Patrick has said he supports that in a certain way. He supports the transparency and the voter accountability and voter involvement. He hasn't explicitly said he supports that bill, but we were hoping that the support from him, as well as other conservative legislators, will help to push that forward. And as far as restorative justice, Mark talked about most of the stuff that we focus on as well: civil asset forfeiture, overcriminalization, and Connie's Burton's bill is something that we are heavily supporting. We're really excited about it because, like he said, it does prohibit violent arrests. And Texas Criminal Justice Coalition just released a report a few weeks ago that they looked at Harris County, Houston arrests, and the time frame was about 16 weeks over the summer. And what they found was that a lot of people, a large percentage of people that were arrested, I think it was somewhere around 10%, which is a large percentage to be arrested for only committing a violent crime. And this was just, seatbelt violations, registration, speeding, which, like you said, speeding is illegal, but TCJC Harris County is arresting people for speeding. So we're hoping to get some more information. We have that information on Restore Justice. We're hoping to get the exact information, kind of highlight how they are going about breaking this law, if that's the case. We haven't independently verified their report, but they have that all there, and we have that on our website if you want to check that out. And I did bring a few of our newsletters, which have all the criminal justice reform bills that we found as of when it's printed, as well as civil asset forfeiture bills. They're two separate categories. And I think there's some more information there about all the things that we're going to be supporting this session. This was printed shortly after early filing started, so there's not everything that we have to update, but our priority legislation on our website will continuously be updated with issues that we're focusing on and bills that we're supporting. And as Scott mentioned, we have our fiscal index that comes out after session with legislators, and gives them rating on who should support, who's your taxpayer champion, who's not, who's lying to you when they come back and say they voted good, but they did it, and it breaks it down by vote, so you guys can do all the research. And I did want to introduce Reagan, who is our Houston correspondent. He works with me at our Houston office, and he does great work. So feel free to check out our website for more information. Thank you, guys.
I'm done, Dale.